Olivia Harris, a 35-year-old attorney based in New York, had spent the last decade fighting for justice, particularly for marginalized communities. Though she had built a solid reputation in the legal world, her appearance in public was often understated. Nothing about her stood out unless you knew her story. On this particular afternoon, dressed simply in a white button-up shirt, blue jeans, and sneakers, Olivia looked like any other person walking down the street. It was a peaceful, quiet day as she entered a local supermarket in her neighborhood, hoping to enjoy a brief break from her usual hectic schedule. For Olivia, these small moments of solitude, standing in front of the shelves, picking out groceries, were a rare and treasured opportunity. After days spent in the courtroom, arguing on behalf of her clients, she appreciated these seemingly insignificant activities. The hum of the fluorescent lights, the shuffle of feet, and the soft clink of cans being placed in shopping carts filled the air, offering a serene escape from the demands of her high-pressure career. But as Olivia walked down the aisle of the supermarket, quietly selecting her items, the calm was suddenly shattered. At the end of the aisle, a tall man in a police uniform, Officer Mike Johnson, dropped a packet of noodles and a bottle of soda. The items tumbled onto the floor with a soft thud. Olivia, who was trained to be observant and conscientious in her work, couldn't ignore the sight. What happened next, however, wasn't what she had expected. Officer Mike didn't make any move to pick up the items. Instead, he glanced at the mess and walked away casually, as if it were of no concern to him. This nonchalance, the disregard for something as simple as cleaning up after oneself, struck Olivia deeply. To her, it represented something more significant, a lack of accountability, especially from someone who, by virtue of their uniform, was supposed to set an example. Her instincts kicked in. She couldn't just let this go. Olivia couldn't just stand there and ignore what she had witnessed. As a lawyer, she had spent years fighting for accountability, fairness, and justice. In that moment, she felt a deep sense of responsibility to speak up, even for something as seemingly small as a spilled bottle and noodles. She was used to confronting much larger issues in the courtroom, but this situation still felt important. After all, the way people behave in the small, everyday moments says a lot about their character, and as an officer of the law, Mike should have known better. Taking a deep breath, Olivia approached the scene. Her voice, calm but firm, broke the silence. "Excuse me, sir," she began, making sure to get his attention. "You just dropped some items. Maybe you should pick them up so others don't trip or have to deal with the mess." Officer Mike Johnson, still standing at the end of the aisle, glanced at her. His eyes flicked over to the noodles and soda for a moment, then quickly shifted away, as though the situation didn't warrant his attention. He turned his back to her, clearly irritated by her interruption. Olivia stood her ground. With a dismissive smile, he looked her up and down and muttered under his breath, "Who do you think you are to tell me what to do?" His voice was laced with sarcasm, a tone that seemed to suggest she had crossed some invisible line by offering a suggestion. He didn't pause for a second before continuing, "I don't have time to worry about something as trivial as this. It's not my problem." Olivia felt a wave of frustration wash over her, but she remained composed. She had dealt with arrogant individuals before, and she knew how to handle herself. However, there was something different about this moment. Mike wasn't just dismissing a piece of trash on the floor. He was dismissing his responsibility as an officer of the law, a person expected to lead by example in the community. She wasn't about to let that slide. Her eyes locked onto his, and she replied, her voice steady but pointed, "As a police officer, you have a responsibility to set an example for the people around you. Picking up a few dropped items isn't just about cleaning up after yourself. It's about showing respect for everyone, for your job, and for the community you serve." The words hung in the air, but Mike didn't seem moved. Instead, he narrowed his eyes, his smug expression not faltering. "You think you know so much about my responsibilities, huh? I'm not here to waste my time on nonsense like this. You should mind your own business." The crowd around them had started to take notice. People were beginning to slow down, looking over at the confrontation, sensing that this was no longer just about spilled noodles. Olivia could feel the curious eyes on her, but she wasn't backing down. She knew this wasn't just a small matter. It wasn't about the noodles. It was about accountability, integrity, and standing up to the abuse of power, even in the smallest of actions. Olivia's calm, Yet firm response to Mike's dismissal only seemed to fuel his arrogance. He stood taller, shifting his weight onto one leg, his posture signaling superiority. The mocking smile on his face widened, and he crossed his arms as if the situation was beneath him. The air between them thickened, and Olivia could feel the intensity of the moment. She wasn't just challenging a man in a police uniform. She was challenging a system, a mentality that allowed those in power to dismiss their responsibility to the public, to abuse their position without consequence. And she knew it wasn't just a personal matter anymore. This was about standing up for integrity, accountability, and the greater good. Mike's dismissive tone was now laced with contempt. "Look, lady, I don't need a lecture from you," he sneered. "This is just some spilled stuff. Get over it." His words dripped with condescension, and Olivia could see that he was doing everything in his power to intimidate her, to make her back off. But she wouldn't. She couldn't. She had spent her entire career fighting against injustice. And no matter how small or large the issue, she wasn't about to let this moment pass without standing her ground. She met his gaze, not flinching. Her voice was still calm, but it carried a weight of authority that commanded attention. "This isn't about a spilled drink, Mike. This is about something bigger. It's about the example you're setting as an officer of the law. You represent a position of power, and the way you handle even the smallest of tasks reflects on your profession, your duty, and the trust people place in you." Olivia could feel the eyes of the crowd on her. People had stopped what they were doing and were watching the exchange. Some seemed uncomfortable, others curious, but Olivia stood firm, unwavering. The moment had transformed from an argument over spilled noodles to a public confrontation about accountability. She wasn't going to let Mike's arrogance go unchallenged, not in front of the very people he was supposed to protect. Mike, however, wasn't having it. He took a step forward, his chest puffed out, trying to use his size and uniform to intimidate her. "Who do you think you're talking to?" he barked. "You're just a regular woman, nothing special. You have no right to lecture me about my job. I'm a cop, and you're just, well, you're nothing." Olivia's heart raced, but she kept her composure. She had heard these kinds of words before from people who thought their job title gave them the right to treat others with disrespect. It was nothing new to her. What Mike didn't understand, however, was that her fight wasn't just about this moment. It was about dismantling the barriers that allowed people like him to abuse their power, to ignore the very values they swore to uphold. She felt a surge of anger, but she quickly suppressed it, channeling the years of training she had in the courtroom, where the key to success was always keeping her cool. "Mike," she said, her voice growing firmer, "this isn't about who I am or what you think I deserve. This is about what you represent. The way you handle situations, whether it's picking up a spilled drink or treating a citizen with respect, says everything about your character. And right now, you're showing none." For a moment, Mike was silent, the smirk faltering on his face. Olivia knew she had struck a nerve. She had shifted the narrative from a small disagreement to a fundamental issue of ethics. She wasn't just trying to get him to pick up a bottle. She was making him see the bigger picture, a picture he didn't want to face. The reality that, in his position of power, he had an obligation to do better, not just for himself, but for everyone around him. The tension in the supermarket was palpable now. People had stopped shopping, their attention completely focused on the confrontation. Olivia could feel their eyes on her, some of them perhaps unsure about the way the situation was unfolding, others perhaps silently rooting for her. But she stood tall, her stance unwavering. She knew that this was more than a personal battle. It was a moment to show the community what it meant to stand up against injustice, no matter how small it seemed. Mike, however, wasn't ready to admit defeat. He scoffed, stepping back and shaking his head. "You think you've got me figured out, don't you?" His voice was tinged with frustration, but Olivia wasn't fooled. She knew he was only lashing out because he was losing control of the situation. But she wasn't about to back down now. "I'm not trying to figure you out, Mike," Olivia said, her voice steady but cutting. "I'm simply holding you accountable. And if you don't like it, that's on you. You're the one who chose to wear that badge." The crowd was silent, and Mike, despite his best efforts to assert control, was now standing there, exposed. Olivia had done what she set out to do. She had called out his arrogance, his lack of responsibility, and his abuse of power. The ball was now in his court. Would he continue to try to dismiss her? Or would he finally recognize the lesson she was trying to teach him? The atmosphere was thick with tension, and Olivia knew this was only the beginning. The standoff between Olivia and Mike escalated, the tension in the supermarket rising like a thick fog. Mike, still trying to maintain his sense of superiority, glared at Olivia, his hands balled into fists at his sides. His earlier confidence had started to crack, though he was determined not to let it show. Olivia could see the anger in his eyes, a desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. But she wasn't intimidated. She had faced much tougher adversaries in the courtroom, and this wasn't much different. It was about principles, and she would fight for them, no matter the cost. Mike's voice was low, almost menacing, as he took a step closer to Olivia. "You really think you can lecture me on responsibility? I'm a police officer, lady. What do you know about power, about what it's like to carry a badge and uphold the law?" His tone was thick with condescension, as though he believed his uniform granted him the right to belittle anyone who dared challenge him. Olivia didn't flinch. Her gaze never wavered as she met his intense stare. "I know a lot about responsibility, Mike. Responsibility means understanding that the power you hold isn't yours to abuse. It's meant to serve and protect, not intimidate and disrespect." She spoke each word with clarity, her voice steady despite the simmering tension. Mike let out a mocking laugh, clearly trying to undermine her composure. "Serve and protect, huh? You really think I'm doing something wrong here? It's just a bottle and some noodles. You're making a mountain out of a molehill, lady." Olivia could feel the crowd's eyes on them, the weight of their attention pressing down on her. She wasn't just representing herself in this moment. She was standing up for the idea that those in positions of power must be held accountable for their actions. Mike's casual disregard for even the smallest responsibilities was just a symptom of a much bigger issue, a culture of impunity that allowed people like him to abuse their authority without consequence. She took a deep breath, her calm demeanor unwavering. "This isn't about the noodles, Mike. This is about accountability, about setting an example. As an officer of the law, your actions matter, and people are watching. What you do, even in private moments like this, reflects on your profession. If you can't take responsibility for something as simple as picking up a spilled bottle, what does that say about your ability to handle bigger responsibilities?" Her words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, Mike seemed taken aback. The usual arrogance in his eyes faltered, replaced by a flicker of doubt. Olivia knew she had struck a nerve, and that realization made her feel a sense of victory. But the battle wasn't over yet. Mike's pride wouldn't allow him to back down so easily. With a sneer, Mike stepped forward, his chest puffed out. "You're just some ordinary woman," he spat, his voice sharp. "What right do you have to lecture me, huh? I could have you thrown out of here in a second." But Olivia wasn't afraid. She stood tall, unshaken by his words. "You can threaten me all you want, but it's not going to change the truth. Your actions matter. And right now, you're failing to uphold the values you swore to protect." The surrounding crowd, once quiet and uncertain, began to murmur. Olivia's words were starting to resonate with them. This wasn't just a confrontation between her and Mike. It was a fight for what was right. The tension in the air grew thick, but Olivia remained as calm as ever, her resolve strengthening with each passing second. She wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. Mike's face flushed with anger, but he knew, deep down, that Olivia was right. Yet, his pride refused to let him admit it. The standoff had reached its breaking point. The crowd waited for the next move, but Olivia was already one step ahead. She wasn't just standing up for herself anymore. She was standing up for the integrity of the system and the community that trusted the people in power to do the right thing. Olivia knew that this wasn't just an argument she could win with words alone. Mike's arrogance and stubbornness weren't going to be shaken by a simple conversation. He was too entrenched in his own sense of entitlement, too resistant to change. But Olivia wasn't about to let this go. She knew how important it was to hold people in power accountable, especially when they were so willing to disregard their responsibilities. As the tension in the supermarket continued to build, Olivia made a decision. She wasn't going to let Mike continue to act with impunity, and she knew exactly how to take this to the next level. With a calm but deliberate motion, she reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. She didn't act in a rush. She didn't panic. She knew exactly what she needed to do. This wasn't about getting angry or retaliating. It was about making sure that what had happened here didn't go unnoticed. Mike's eyes narrowed as he saw her pulling out her phone. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice laced with suspicion. But Olivia didn't answer him. Instead, she dialed the number for the local authorities, her fingers steady as she typed. The moment she heard the line connect, she spoke clearly, her voice firm. "I need support at the central supermarket. There's a police officer here who is abusing his power and threatening people. I need the appropriate personnel to come immediately." Her words were calm, precise, and unwavering. As she spoke, the atmosphere around her shifted. The crowd, which had been watching the confrontation unfold, grew even more silent, almost holding its collective breath. Olivia wasn't backing down. She wasn't afraid of Mike, and she wasn't afraid of the consequences. She was doing what needed to be done to ensure justice was served. Mike's face shifted from irritation to shock. He clearly hadn't expected Olivia to escalate the situation like this, and the realization that his actions were being recorded and reported hit him hard. The power dynamic was shifting. Olivia wasn't just confronting him. She was making sure the situation was documented, that his behavior would have consequences. The sound of sirens in the distance only added to the mounting pressure. Olivia stood, unwavering, her resolve as strong as ever. She wasn't afraid of what might happen next. She had already won. As Olivia ended the call, the atmosphere in the supermarket shifted noticeably. The once tense silence now hung heavily in the air as the sound of sirens grew louder in the distance, signaling the arrival of backup. Mike, realizing that his position was rapidly becoming untenable, glared at Olivia, his earlier arrogance replaced by something more akin to nervousness. His defiance, which had once been an assertion of control, was now starting to unravel. He was a man used to intimidating others, but this time, the tables had turned. The other customers in the store, who had been silently observing the confrontation, began to stir, some of them now pulling out their phones to document the scene. Olivia's calm and composed demeanor stood in stark contrast to Mike's growing agitation. He knew that, in the eyes of the law, this wasn't just a minor spat in the aisles of a supermarket. It was about his actions as an officer, the abuse of his power, and the consequences that would follow. His smirk faltered as the reality of the situation settled in. Before Mike could respond, the door to the supermarket swung open, and a pair of uniformed officers entered, walking in with a sense of purpose. Olivia didn't flinch. She simply stepped aside, pointing towards Mike, her gaze unwavering. The two officers immediately recognized the tension in the room. Olivia wasted no time. "This is the person you need to speak to," she said, her voice calm but carrying the weight of authority. "All of his actions have been documented and witnessed. He's been abusing his power, and I've had enough." Mike's confident posture crumbled. He was no longer the figure of authority in the room. The officers approached him, their eyes narrowing as they assessed the situation. One of them spoke into a radio, calling for backup, while the other turned to Mike. It was clear that they knew this was serious. There was no more room for doubt or denial. The people in the store watched intently as Mike, now visibly uncomfortable, was quietly escorted to the side, away from Olivia. Just as the officers were about to proceed, the door to the supermarket opened again, and the mayor of New York, Andrew Preston, entered the scene. His sharp eyes scanned the room, and he wasted no time in walking toward Olivia. His presence immediately commanded respect, and the entire store fell into an uneasy silence. "Colonel Harris, I've heard about the situation," the mayor said, his voice authoritative yet calm. "I apologize for the actions of one of my officers. This is completely unacceptable." Olivia nodded, still calm but no less resolute. "Thank you, Mayor Preston. But this isn't just about me. This is about everyone who is subjected to the abuse of power, whether big or small. People deserve to feel safe, not intimidated. If this situation had gone unchecked, there would have been others who were mistreated, just like I was." The mayor turned to Mike, his gaze cold and unwavering. "Officer Johnson, your behavior has been reported and witnessed by several people. You failed to uphold the very principles you swore to protect. You're no longer fit to wear this uniform." As the mayor spoke, the crowd began to murmur, many of them nodding in agreement with Olivia's words. The tension in the supermarket was beginning to lift, but it was clear that the impact of what had just transpired would be felt far beyond this one incident. Mike, now visibly humiliated, stood in silence as the officers moved in to strip him of his badge and weapon, his career unraveling in front of him. Olivia, meanwhile, stood tall, knowing that her actions had set a powerful example of what it meant to stand up for what was right, regardless of the cost. The crowd, once filled with doubt and uncertainty, now looked at her with admiration. She had faced down a bully in uniform, and in the end, justice had prevailed. The events in the supermarket were far from over, but they had already set off a ripple effect that was impossible to ignore. As the officers escorted Mike out, a sense of calm began to return to the store, but Olivia knew that the consequences of what had just transpired would go far beyond this single moment. In the hours that followed, the news spread quickly through the community, sparking conversations about responsibility, integrity, and the abuse of power, issues that many had kept silent about for far too long. The media picked up the story almost immediately, with reports flooding local news outlets. Olivia's calm and composed demeanor in the face of Mike's taunts, her willingness to take action and stand up against injustice, made her a symbol of courage for many. Interviews with witnesses and videos from bystanders began to circulate on social media, showing Olivia's steady resolve in the face of overwhelming odds. What had started as a confrontation over something as trivial as spilled noodles had transformed into a much larger conversation about the responsibilities of those in power and the importance of holding them accountable for their actions. In the weeks that followed, Olivia was invited to speak at community events and panels, where she shared her experience. She wasn't interested in the spotlight, but she knew that her story could help spark real change. She was determined to make sure that Mike's actions and the larger issue they represented weren't swept under the rug. She was an attorney, yes, but more than that, she was a citizen with a deep sense of responsibility to her community. She spoke not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been disrespected or abused by those in positions of power. At one of these panels, Olivia spoke with a group of law enforcement professionals about the importance of accountability in policing. This situation might seem small, she said, but it's a reminder that the way we behave in every moment counts. If we ignore the small things, we allow a culture of complacency to take root. It's not just about enforcing the law, it's about setting an example. And when we fail to do that, we risk losing the trust of the people we're meant to protect. Her words resonated deeply with the audience. She wasn't just talking about Mike. She was talking about the broader issue of how people in authority often misuse their power, whether intentionally or out of negligence. She urged those in law enforcement to examine their actions and attitudes, to reflect on the impact they had on the community. Olivia knew that change wouldn't come overnight, but she was committed to pushing for it, one conversation at a time. As the story of Olivia's stand against injustice continued to spread, the pressure on local law enforcement to address the situation grew. The police department, under increasing scrutiny, launched an internal investigation into Mike's conduct. The investigation quickly revealed a troubling pattern of misconduct. It wasn't just this one incident that had gone unchallenged. There were others, including complaints from citizens who had been treated unfairly or harassed. Mike had abused his position of power, and now it was coming back to haunt him. The community's response was overwhelmingly positive. People began to speak out more, sharing their own experiences of being mistreated or ignored by those in positions of power. Olivia's story had given them a voice, a sense of courage to stand up for what was right. In the days that followed, citizens organized peaceful protests and community forums to demand accountability and transparency from law enforcement. Olivia was invited to be a keynote speaker at several of these events, where she continued to encourage people to speak up against injustice. "We all have a responsibility," she said during one speech, "to make sure that the people who are supposed to protect us are held to the same standards as everyone else. We can't be silent when we see something wrong. The only way to make a real difference is to stand up, speak out, and demand change." It wasn't just the public that was listening. Change was also beginning to take place within the police department. The chief of police publicly acknowledged the failures in Mike's actions and promised to implement new training programs that would focus on ethics, accountability, and community engagement. The department also began reviewing its hiring practices and disciplinary procedures to ensure that officers who didn't meet the standards of integrity and professionalism would be held accountable. Olivia's actions had sparked something far greater than just one man's downfall. They had ignited a movement, one that pushed for a culture of respect, accountability, and justice in the very institutions that were supposed to uphold those values. Olivia may not have set out to start a revolution, but in standing up for what was right, she had become a beacon of hope for a community desperate for change. As Olivia walked away from the scene, she couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of satisfaction. She hadn't sought recognition, nor had she expected a dramatic outcome. What mattered to her was the larger impact of her actions, the realization that standing up for what was right, no matter how uncomfortable or difficult, could create real change. She wasn't just defending her own dignity. She was standing up for every person who had ever felt powerless in the face of authority. The weeks following the supermarket incident were a whirlwind. Olivia continued to attend public forums and speak out about accountability, not just within law enforcement, but in all systems of power. Her message was clear. Every individual had a responsibility to ensure that those in positions of authority upheld the standards of fairness and respect. There could be no tolerance for complacency or indifference, especially when it came to those who were entrusted with public safety. Though the media attention eventually faded, the changes she had sparked were far from temporary. Olivia's words had reached a wide audience, and the movement she had helped ignite continued to grow. Her story had become a symbol of integrity, reminding people that true strength didn't come from power or intimidation, but from doing the right thing, even when it was difficult. For Olivia, the outcome wasn't just about seeing Mike face the consequences of his actions. It was about sending a message that the fight for justice was ongoing. The work wasn't over. There would always be people in power who sought to exploit their position, but as long as there were people like Olivia willing to stand up, there was hope for a better future. In her quiet moments, Olivia often reflected on what had happened. She had learned that it wasn't just about confronting individuals like Mike, but about challenging the systems that allowed such behavior to flourish. The lesson she took away was clear. Standing up for what's right might be difficult, but it was always worth it. And in doing so, she had become part of a larger movement, a movement for fairness, respect, and accountability that would continue to inspire others long after the headlines faded.